I'm primarily actually an observational research specialist, mostly in the diabetes area, but we're looking more and more at trying to bring more randomized data into our practice and looking at efficient ways to do that. I did my due diligence and did a thorough review of studies that had more streamlined, more efficient ways of running. And one of the major ways to streamline a study and gain various advantages is to modify the informed consent process, which is how I came to do a systematic review about what I'm calling randomization without consent. And I think it is good to talk about it here because what I'm going to be able to do is talk about the history of trial designs that I think are relevant to TWICs in the sense that they raise some of the same ethical issues, some of the same implementation challenges. I know Claire is hoping that I will clean up some terminology or help standardize it. I think we should just hope that I don't make things worse. Just to position things historically a little bit, kind of the modern research ethics paradigm where informed consent started to be seen as essentially mandatory for RCTs could be dated to various places, but one would be 1966 with Beecher's paper, where he showed that lots of bad things happen if we don't ask permission. And then over the next 20 years or 30 years, kind of the modern research regulatory international framework and sort of standard bioethics was consolidated. And my view of all of that is pretty US-centric. One interesting thing that I think will come up over the next 2 days is how issues vary from country to country. On that note, by the way, if related to country-specific issues or really anything people would like to interrupt during this presentation, please do. That's really just fine. I think it would be useful if people have questions. As Dr. Nichols alluded to, the idea that informed consent may not be mandatory for all randomized controlled trials is not a new one or one that we should reflexively reject. From very early in the development of modern research regulation, there was a Zelen proposal to omit informed consent for at least some participants. And in the early 1980s, an interesting back and forth between Zelen and the regulators where a trial design was developed that's a clear precursor to TWICs and that still raises kind of interesting and challenging issues today. So these kinds of discussions are not new. Emergency research indeed got very firmly established early on and is now clearly coded into statutes as a situation where you don't have to obtain informed consent. There was a proposal in the very late 90s in 1999, published in the New England Journal, that was really a pretty passionate argument that informed consent is doing harm for certain kinds of what I think we would now call pragmatic trials, and that the world would be a better place if we could omit it entirely in some situations. And Trug gets to have an eponym for his proposal because he didn't come up with an acronym. Claire doesn't because she came up with a good acronym, unless we just want to make Claire uncomfortable by calling it the Claire proposal in 2010. And over the last 10 or 15 years, there have been some other developments that I think provide important context. Actually, one thing that should be on this list but isn't is increasing interest in pragmatic trial designs. Another is the evolution of the learning healthcare system concept, which I think is especially new and important in the US, where we really didn't have it before. An increasing emphasis on the importance of comparative effectiveness research as opposed to abstract studies of mechanism. And a little bit of a failure of observational research to be very useful for informing a lot of hard comparative effectiveness questions. Redirecting attention back to how we can get more randomized trials done. So across this history, there have always been objections to informed consent. There's the point that it generally fails to inform patients completely and sometimes even maybe fails to inform them meaningfully. And the situation where the more you tell people, sometimes the less they understand. There's the concern that was raised early on by Zelen that informed consent may cause emotional distress, particularly for patients who don't ultimately get randomized to a preferred treatment. And then there's the argument that I think Trug in the late 90s really started to make, but that I think I'm now hearing more and more, which is that informed consent may really, modern standards may actively be doing some harm because there's such a deficit of comparative effectiveness and low-risk research and opportunities to improve healthcare with good evidence. And there are people who argue that on a kind of systemic level, informed consent is enough of a burden that it really reduces the volume of such research to the point where there's almost a moral imperative to try and reform standards a little bit. By improving standards, I could mean a lot of things. There's a long history of efforts to improve informed consent by keeping the forms short and to the point and cutting down on boilerplate. there is also a history of trying to make consent a fast oral process that can easily be incorporated into extreme care. Extreme care, I mean routine care. On a pretty related concept is moving from an opt-out framework towards an opt-in framework. And then there's a concept that I think is especially relevant to TWICS and its evolution, which is of staged consent, where you have multiple meetings over time and are able to only present pertinent information at any given meeting. The topic that I ended up focused on was what I think it's fair to call a more extreme idea, which is to eliminate consent entirely for at least some patients. The kind of concept that I was trying to capture and understand better was originally just the extreme idea of a pragmatic trial where you do randomization and you simply don't get consent at all. Trying to operationalize that idea so we could do a systematic review, I came up with a CRISPR definition that I was interested in trials that randomized patients without getting consent to randomization from all patients. So that definition turned out to cover both your trials that obtain no consent whatsoever, your trials that omit consent for certain patients, especially those getting usual care, as in Zellin designs, including TWICS, and trials that consent all patients but don't necessarily disclose randomization to all patients, again including some forms of Zellin and TWICS. What I'm really not looking at in this review, but that we want to keep in mind as extremely important context, is trials that disclose randomization to everybody, but in an abbreviated verbal or a staged way. So in conducting this review, I will say I think we were able, and I would be delighted to learn that I'm wrong, but I think we were able to find all the major proposals that are out there. We definitely didn't find every instance of randomization without consent. There are some unknown number of trials that's probably fairly high, in which patients were not consented, but the paper doesn't include a very sophisticated or detailed explanation of why not. So I'm just focusing here on kind of fully developed proposals where the ethics and the reproducibility of the idea are really thought out. And kind of the payoff of this exercise was this, and this is a kind of deliberately overly crowded slide. I'll go to the relevant components of it over the course of the talk. But what we found was that there were 10 such proposals. There had been a lot of ingenuity put into this over the years, and that they fractured fairly naturally into 3 categories. Up on the left in blue was the thing that originally interested me and that I had proposed myself, which is to randomize and just not even talk to the patient about it. That's sort of your extreme. Down here in pink are a set of trials that are actually, the other thing the trials in blue have in common is that they're never done. Down in pink are the trials that are done a lot, and these are cluster and emergency studies in which there is a clear precedent and a clear rationale based on necessity for omitting informed consent. And then in green we have this large and very complex family of Zellin designs, which I've gone ahead and put TWICS within. At the time it was going by its original acronym, the Cohort Multiple RCT. And looking at these different categories and at the different ethical issues they raise, I think is going to be relevant background for the rest of this meeting. So let's go do that. Here's your classic RCT design. We put a lot of time into the kind of semiotics of this flow sheet, but I don't think it's worth discussing any of them. I think it's fairly intuitive what I'm trying to show you here. Here's emergency research in at least one of its more basic forms. Leaving aside the question of consent after the fact, which I wasn't really planning to talk about today, it is possible to get approval for a study in an emergency setting where you simply randomize the patient to the experimental or the standard treatment and you're done. So the one modification from the original design is the omission of consent. I would actually be curious what the actual count is of studies done under such a waiver. It's certainly a high number. Here's a fairly arbitrarily selected example. One thing to point out is the text in yellow. This is a theme that's going to come back over and over again. So they were able to waive informed consent for this study, as for many others, because they were studying an intervention in the setting of emergent intubation. There was really not going to be time to responsibly have any kind of discussion about this. So they got a consent waiver, but there was an expectation that there would be appropriate community consultation and notification. So an exercise meant to achieve some of the goals of individual informed consent. And you'll see over and over again that I think perhaps literally every proposal for research without consent, or RWAC, includes some kind of provision of this type. but that inclusion is often fairly vague, as it was in this case. The other category of trial, which it's tempting to spend a lot of time on because this is fascinating, but I won't because it's not relevant, I don't think, is cluster randomized designs. Here again, there's a very large number of trials that have been done with cluster randomization that did not obtain consent from individual participants. There's a really nice analysis. This is a paper I really enjoyed that I recommend people look at just for intellectual interest by Sim and Dawson, where they looked at informed consent and cluster randomization. And they raise a key distinction, which is that there are really two kinds of cluster randomized trials. There are trials where it really, truly just doesn't make sense to get informed consent from individuals. And a classic example would be something where you're abating lead in a community's water supply. You could go through the exercise of talking to everybody in the community and trying to get their individual permission to modify their town's plumbing, but it's really unclear what the earthly point is of doing that. If you're going to modify infrastructure in a city, it's going to affect everybody, whether they give individual consent or not. So if you want to do, and since you're presumably not going to be able to get consent from every single person in a community, there's really no way to do this study and have meaningful informed consent. The interesting observation that Sim and Dawson make is that there's a lot of cluster randomized trials for which that isn't really true. One example would be a setting where in certain clinics antihypertensive drug A is used, and in certain clinics antihypertensive drug B is used. Certainly, it sounds like there's actually a more sophisticated, what I'll go ahead and call a more sophisticated approach to it in the United Kingdom and in Europe. In the US, there's not really a very standard approach to informed consent for studies like that. In some cases, they are done without individual informed consent. And it's not as clear that that's justified because there is no reason you couldn't give people the opportunity to opt out and select their antihypertensive. What general themes does this raise for us that are relevant to Twix? The point I would make is that, again, this is a case where the inability to obtain informed consent was a key step in getting the RWalk design to be widely accepted. However, there is room for some debate about whether or not it's actually impossible to get informed consent in all of these situations. Another point that I think is relevant to Twix is that deeply baked into any standard for approving cluster randomized studies is this need for community notification and, if possible, community level consent. But again, the standards for this are not completely clear, and different trials do this to a very different degree. So those are our RN feasibility designs. And these are by far the most widely used forms of randomization without consent. The next category to look at is the least widely used form, in the sense that it's been done maybe twice, if that, which is to do a pragmatic randomized controlled trial without consent. I'll say, by the way, so there's 3 published proposals that we put into this category. I don't think any of them actually use the term pragmatic trial as an inherent feature of these kinds of designs. I put that in there because it was something they strikingly had in common. People don't really talk about doing this kind of study unless you're comparing 2 standards of care and you're doing it in a relatively unsupervised pragmatic framework, because it doesn't really make sense for other types of questions. The first proposal I'm aware of to do something like this was the Trug paper in 1999, where he sort of laid out the paradigm for this, which is this constant frustration in clinical practice where you're treating something benign and common like bronchitis. You have 2 or more options. You're choosing between them. You know you're making that choice very arbitrarily. And it would be very easy and seemingly would do very little harm to simply make that choice at random. Then over time, you would generate evidence that you could actually use to drive clinical decisions, and everybody would be better off. But because the question isn't crucially important in and of itself, and because there is a fair amount of burden involved in getting informed consent from individual patients, the study simply never gets done. That was what was bothering Trug. It's what bothers me a lot. It's kind of the driving intuition behind these kinds of proposals. Trug's paper was very influential and widely cited and shaped the way a lot of people thought, but it didn't result in any trials following that design. Recently, this concept has really come back and been spoken about more, again in very high-profile journals. What's interesting is it's almost the same conversation, This is a lot of text to read, but basically this is an outline of a trial of 2 antihypertensive medications. Very common clinical decision, both very accepted standards of care, not a lot of reason to choose between the two. The question is, why can't we make this, the question is still, why can't we make this fundamentally arbitrary choice randomly so that we generate evidence? So that's the Trug case again. What's interesting about this more recent paper is that it talks very heavily and seriously about the context in which a study like this is going to be ethical. And the point made by Faden and colleagues was, we think that this is ethically acceptable, maybe even approvable by a regulatory body, but only if it's implemented in a healthcare context where patients are regularly informed that they might be randomized to things sometimes without their consent, and where there's infrastructure, meaning careful review in place to ensure that patients' interests and rights are being protected. Although the phrase doesn't appear in this quote, what these authors were talking about explicitly was a learning healthcare system, which is not purely a piece of jargon. There's actually a pretty detailed sort of there's a pretty detailed definition of what that means that came out of an Institute of Medicine report in 2007, and it's pretty specific requirements. It includes a governance body that has input from patient stakeholders. Importantly, it includes an electronic health record that's robust enough to permit meaningful tracking of a cohort of patients over time. It includes persistent follow-up of a cohort of patients, so shades of Twix here. And it remains to be seen if, unlike the original proposal, if this kind of proposal nested within a learning healthcare system will actually happen. But there's enough momentum behind it that it might. And the key ethical difference there appears to be all about the context, all about the opportunity to have a cohort over time that you can inform with means outside of traditional informed consent. Another point that came out of this that was of a lot of interest was that one common feature these design proposals have is very strong assurances of safety, very strong assurances of equipoise. And a colleague of mine and I actually had a third proposal, which for reasons of brevity I didn't put up here, where that was really what we focused on. We came up with a design that we felt nobody could say would violate requirements, that the treatment be equally acceptable to all parties involved, and so forth. What's interesting is, even if you do a really good job resolving those issues, you still have a lot of trouble gaining traction for proposals like this. They still don't take off. And the reason for that seems to be issues around autonomy. This is where it's worth stepping back for a second to talk about the purpose for informed consent. This is one paper. There's a lot of accounts of what informed consent is for and why we really do it. But probably I would agree with this assessment that at least the leading reason, if not the only reason, is to demonstrate respect for subject autonomy. It's not to prevent material harms or harms to confidentiality or things like that. I think most of us believe that we have robust regulatory authorities looking after that, and even that those authorities can probably do a better job of that than patients can when this decision making is so complicated. But even if you think all that stuff is being beautifully taken care of, informed consent still plays a key role that it's hard to replicate in another way, which is it gives the patient ownership over what's happening with them and their data, ownership over fundamentally how their care is being arranged. So since that's an ethical argument, that's a point that's been raised without evidence for a long time, so it's worth asking, how do patients feel about this? And one way of getting at this empirically is, how do patients feel about being put in low-risk research without consent? Once it's established that there's no material risk to them, are they still offended or bothered by that? And the answer is they don't feel great if you don't get consent. For one hypothetical comparative effectiveness research trial comparing antihypertensives, they found that 70% of patients thought a traditional opt-in written consent would be fine, which is an interestingly low number, but at least it's 70%. Nearly the same, interestingly, were okay with an opt-out consent, which was similar to, which in this study was described as a very brief verbal discussion where the patient, if they said no, they wouldn't be in the trial, but otherwise they would. But only 40% liked the idea of a general informed consent where they wouldn't discuss randomization or a specific study. There would just be an understanding that they could be randomized in this way at any time in their care. And that's after a day of deliberation, actually. Although deliberation and education about research ethics did raise the tolerability of general consent for these patients, it didn't bring it to a very high number. That is sort of similar to putting this question to a vote to the general public, which, as people have noted, sometimes leads to strange foreign policy decisions and strange presidential candidates. I think that I don't think this should end the argument. This is a really technical, difficult question. It's the kind of thing where it shouldn't just be put up to a plebiscite. So maybe you would find with sufficiently long deliberation or with the right kind of tweaks to the design or framing things using exactly the right kind of language, that approval rates of general consent would get much higher to whatever numerical threshold we decide we think is acceptable for moving forward with the research design. So I'm not trying to use this evidence to argue that any of these approaches is improper. I'm just using it to support the claim that this concern about autonomy and patients feeling respected really can't be ignored, because there are strong feelings here. One word of warning about that attitude, though, is in a survey of attitudes towards electronic health records research, just passive analysis of medical records, 91 of patients want consent explicitly for that, which might actually be realistic in this country. It's not remotely what happens in the United States. So this is a very complicated back and forth between what the research community is doing and what patients actually want. This is just another slide sort of beating home the same point in a different way. Again, the general point would be for a variety of different kinds of studies, including randomized studies over on the right, a large majority of patients want some kind of explicit consent. Although, and surprisingly, just over half of patients still want written permission. So what do we learn overall from looking at this idea of pragmatic trials without consent? First of all, just showing that a study can't possibly hurt a patient in a material way or in terms of confidentiality does not win the argument that the patient doesn't need to give consent. Autonomy is clearly important. It's something that matters to patients. And I've found compelling the argument that autonomy concerns interact with this idea of a learning healthcare system, of education or communication with patients as a community over time. I think that's a crucial innovation here. So now we get to move on to the really complicated trial designs. I noted earlier that I didn't think I was necessarily going to do all that much to clear up terminology. I will try to make two contributions, though. The first is throughout this talk, I don't use the term randomized consent. That's not because there's anything wrong with the term, but it covers a very sort of broad, complicated catchment area of different study designs. Whenever I've tried to reason using it, I get a little bit, I find that I get confused, partly because it also includes certain kinds of cluster randomization. The term Zelen design, although it's an eponym which I like to avoid, does seem to usefully capture a certain type of research project. And I think a really important terminological and substantive question is whether or not Twix is a Zelen design. A second point I'll make about terminology is, especially as you get to these types of more complex designs, these kinds of visualizations are really helpful. One thing they allow you to do is they can allow you to quickly see if two designs that superficially seem very different are actually doing the same thing. So I recommend these kinds of graphics for general use. I've really found it handy. With that in mind, let's take a graphical approach to what a Zelen design is. So this was a proposal that I think originally came out in 1977. It included this key and very influential insight, which is that trials are not necessarily symmetrical. And although if you're sending someone to an experimental treatment, it seems crystal clear you ought to get their consent. If you are sending other people down to the treatment they would have gotten otherwise, it's a much more interesting conversation, whether or not those people need to give consent. So Zelen's proposal was to eliminate the upfront consent process, just randomize away, get consent to the people being randomized to the experiment, and just let people going to the standard treatment get the standard treatment. He cited a number of advantages. This would be more feasible, it would be easier. Recruitment would be better because fewer people would say no, in particular, fewer people who were going to the control arm would say no. That an enormous amount of psychological distress might be spared, and he was developing this in the context of oncology trials, where that's a that's a really obvious concern. But it's important to keep in mind that this is important for all kinds of clinical areas. That was a compelling account of how it matters in studies of fibromyalgia. He also made a claim that it would help to preserve the physician-patient relationship, which was interesting, and I felt that a quote about that kind of drives home the fact that this was a proposal coming from the late 70s, and there are aspects of his arguments and rationale that seem dated now. This quote, "The physician need not leave himself open in the eyes of the patient to not knowing what he is doing and tossing a coin." First of all, there's the casual assumption that all doctors are male, but second, there's this idea that it's actually morally somehow important to preserve physician authority in the relationship. Like, that's something that I think probably looked right in the 1970s that reads very strangely now. So it's an interesting feature of the original Zelland design that it just, in some ways, comes from a very different time and a very different kind of discourse. His original design almost immediately became impractical for another reason, which was just that in both the US and the UK, there was a clarification in the regulation for research just stating that you really had to know that you were in a study if you were going to be in a study. It might be okay not to mention randomization, but you had to at least tell people they were in research. So Zelland quickly found a good solution to that problem, which was to continue to omit informed consent up front, randomize, and then obtain consent that could be tailored specifically to which treatment a patient was going to, which I still find a very appealing concept. This means that if somebody's going to the experimental arm, you don't have to tell them tons and tons. Well, that doesn't quite work. If someone's going to the standard arm and there's not access to the experimental arm, you don't have to tell them tons and tons about the experimental arm, which I think it's debatable whether or not that's the right thing to do, but I see the appeal. And you also, in principle, can implement this without discussing randomization, which makes for a much shorter and simpler conversation. Lines have been used a total of about 50 times, based on a really good review that was done in 2006. The reasons that it's interesting, the Zelland proposal sort of has a number of different ethical rationales for why it should be used, as we saw a few slides ago. The reasons actually given for its use, first of all, most publications don't provide a reason, but the most commonly given reason was actually prevention of contamination. The researchers felt that the Zelland design allowed them to reduce the rates of crossover from one arm to another, which was interesting because that's really not a key part of the original proposal. And then less surprising, other reasons were less often cited, things like, oh, the consent procedure is simpler, or it distresses patients less. Interestingly, Zelland designs originally were overwhelmingly used for oncology, are used in all medical areas, but nowadays are most commonly used in behavioral health. So I'm trying to avoid layering in too many of my own opinions. I'm trying to just describe what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years. One thing that I think is a fact is that somehow Zelland designs have never shaken off kind of a bit of controversy. One way to see that is that they've only been used about 50 times over 30 years, which is a vanishingly small percentage of all randomized controlled trials. If you look at the reasons that the design hasn't become so widely used, one is fairly complex methodological implications. It does not boost your study power and efficiency as much as you would think it would. You kind of lose power in proportion to the enhanced recruitment. And the other reason is that a lot of people have never become very comfortable with the ethics. Pretty much, this would be an interesting, quick empirical look, but I think if you looked at the last 5 review articles on the Zelland design, you would probably find them all somewhat critical of the ethical grounding for this methodology. And I get to sort of say that and just make it Scott's problem when he gives a talk on ethics later. But that is an empirical observation. People have never been quite comfortable with Zelland. It's clearly legal. You can clearly do it. But people are a little, and by people I mean academic researchers and regulators, are a little suspicious of it. That said, the cohort multiple RCT, TWIX, cohort multiple RCT, as it has changed its name, is a really exciting and promising evolution of this idea. So everybody in this room knows more about this than I do, but TWIX can be specified in various ways. And a lot depends on how you define that initial consent. If there is no consent to future randomization up front. If you just have a cohort consenting to be in studies and have their information used for healthcare research, and then after randomization, the subset getting experimental treatment have outreach on a further consent, I would analyze that as a Zellin double consent with rather modest modifications. And that could be, I mean, that could be debated, but I feel fairly comfortable with that characterization. Then if you do include a consent to future randomization up front, you know, actually I had one dark night of the soul over whether I got to include TWICs in my review, because that would put it outside my formal definition of randomization without consent. Fortunately, I did decide I was able to keep it. But if you include the consent to future randomization, TWICs becomes something of an edge case. It's not clear that we're really omitting any important or traditional component of informed consent. We've just moved to a staged consent model, but an otherwise fairly conventional RCT, where there's one huge innovation, which I give short shrift in this slide, which is the maintenance of a cohort over time, and the use of that to enable multiple trials in the same population. So here are some observations to conclude with. I think these are facts that came out of the review. There's widespread acceptance if you have an infeasibility waiver. If you can make a case that you couldn't do a study well and the study is important with informed consent, you can not do informed consent and it will be okay. There's a requirement that you get some kind of community consent, but that requirement is quite underspecified. There is clearly precedent through the Zellin designs for not obtaining informed consent to randomization when you're just exposing a patient to usual care, but this is a somewhat controversial thing to do. And if you want to obtain no traditional consent to research at all, which is my personal dream, there are high regulatory barriers to that. This slide, I don't know, this slide is a little bit tendentious and doesn't add much, and I'm going to skip it. Here, so, what was that, Andrew?
I was saying we were enjoying that slide.
All right, I'll go back. This is me straying into Scott's territory. This is me doing some hack ethics. So when I looked at this, and whenever I think about this, I find I'm going around in circles through a fairly tight circle of argument. You can take that great insight Zellin had, which is that it's just not clear why you need to give consent to randomization if you're getting usual care that you would have gotten anyway. And the answer to that, there are several answers to that, but the one that I personally find persuasive is that, well, it's disrespectful to patient autonomy if you don't do that. And this, I would think, is the counter to the lottery argument, that if it's true that we're selecting patients out of a cohort, those people are being intervened on, the others aren't having anything special done to them, so why would you need to ask them for consent? I think the counter argument that bothers me is that some of those patients may find that that's somehow disrespectful to them, that as autonomous individuals, they want more control over that, to everything that happens with them. However, that's an abstract argument. It's not, or it's an ethical argument. I don't see empirical evidence that it's correct. And in the meantime, I do feel like there's empirical evidence that patients are receiving a ton of care that's not adequately studied. And if you believe that the reason that an important contributor to that lack of evidence is the barriers formed by informed consent, you wind up right back where you started, wondering why you're still getting this randomization when it seems like it's not doing that much. And I could go through that circle all day. Two empirical questions come up that I think are relevant to getting out of it. I think the autonomy objection is an important one, and a question is there another way to respect autonomy? Is something like the communication with patients as a community that's advised for emergency research or that's advised in cluster randomized trials, is that an adequate substitute? And another way to try to get out of this circle is there a way to lower the burden of informed consent that doesn't mean omitting the parts of informed consent that are important to patients, to respecting patients' autonomy? And this is, I think that people at the NIH have done a good job of pushing back on this point. Like, how hard is it really to get a quick opt-out consent for a trial? Is it really so unreasonable to ask for that? Would so many studies actually happen if we just did that? Thank you. And I think actually that's an extremely important empirical question. I happen to strongly believe that that burden is really high, even if it's a really strong, even if it is a short verbal consent. But I think it's reasonable to ask us to prove that. So with 1 minute remaining, here are some concluding questions. My suggestions for things that might come up over the next couple of days that I think are questions worth answering clearly are, what exactly is the relationship between Twix and the Zellum designs? And the reason I think that's so important is that the Zellum designs have always struggled a little bit. And I would hate for Twix to have as much difficulty obtaining mainstream purchase. I think it's important to understand if that's an issue or not. And if the ethical concerns that are raised about Zellum don't apply to Twix, it's important to say why not. A second question is, what is the relationship between Twix and staged consent? One question is, how hard is it to get that upfront consent? How much can it be streamlined? Can it be streamlined to the point where it's no big deal? And should that prior consent include consent explicitly to randomization? What's the downside of doing that? How much of the virtues of the original Twix proposal do we lose if that's routinely part of the design? And finally, what's the relationship between Twix and learning healthcare systems? Because I think this is a little bit of a US-centric question, I think, because my suspicion is that this is the key step in getting Twix to the States, because I think that's the setting where it could actually be done. Like, does the learning healthcare system count as a cohort? I think that probably is the setting where getting that pre-consent, maintaining those cohorts over time is most feasible. And I suspect that it's that nesting. I personally suspect that nesting within a learning healthcare system is doing a lot of ethical work, is adding a lot to the acceptability and viability of the design over the original Zellum proposals, and it would be interesting to flesh that out further. And I think my time's up. Thanks, everybody.
I thought it was really interesting. I think what you alluded to in your talk is that interesting difference in opinion between the regulators and the people on ethics committee and actually what our community members think and feel about the acceptability. And we've done an awful lot of work in Bradford, and I think there is a difference in opinion. And I think if you go and speak to communities about do they think this is acceptable, then our experience is that absolutely eminently acceptable, and actually they would appreciate less of the technical jargon, and they appreciate that, you know, not having to sift through 17-page information sheets. I just wonder for other research groups who are putting these types of ethics applications in now, whether we just need to try and encourage people to have a lot more structured community consultation about what's acceptable for different patient groups, because I think there is variation in ethics committees across the UK about, you know, we're really lucky in Bradford that we have people that do understand what we do, but I think if we can try and get a bit more of a structured approach to how we're consulting with the target groups about the acceptability and kind of go into ethics with that kind of community approval, then we might find things a bit easier with this issue of randomisation without consent.
How do those people feel about whether or not randomization should be in the initial consent?
Can I ask Sally to answer that?
So we've done some work with the community to understand what they understand by randomisation. I think that's one of the key questions that people really understand by that. And what we're doing in Bradford is recruiting to a new cohort, and when they consent to join the cohort, we explain that some of the projects that might be on offer, there might not be enough places, and we will offer those places by chance. We will select people by chance, and people do not question that. In fact, that's an essential part of our criteria for consenting, and nobody so far has said, no, actually, I don't want to do that.
Any insight into whether those people would be upset if that were not mentioned, but were happening?
Interesting. We haven't looked at that as yet. It's something that we're going to come up against in the study that we're doing next. So we will be taking that to our community group. Because actually coming here now is making me wonder whether we need that in there at all. Because as you say, we're only going to select those individuals. What do people understand by that? Is that something we can take out? Because if everybody's saying yes, is that because it's universally acceptable? Or is it because people don't really pay any attention to that? Actually, unpicking that argument and understanding if that's just something we put in there that people are then falling over.
I mean, I think also the context in which we are implementing this trial design is very community-based. It's about, you know, parenting programs and nutrition programs. and I think there are differences between things that are in a hospital setting where it's about actually,
Sure.
treatment. So
People just getting on with their lives in the cohort, as opposed to just getting on with treatment, which isn't quite such a clear idea.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we've got the statement in there, though, is the idea that if you're not selected to take part, we will compare the results of those people who are with those people who are, and that's the reason we've got our consent statement in like that.
Okay, good. Could you just tell us who you are?
Oh, yes. Me? Yeah. My name is Sophie Gerlich, and I'm from Utrecht. And tomorrow I'm going to talk about the patient's perspective on this study design.
Okay.
So a lot of hopefully I can give some answers as well on the questions that have been raised today. So about how they would feel if there would be a control patient after randomization. Tomorrow.
So we know something about this.
Can be here as well.
Okay, that was an advertisement. So can you tell us again who you are first?
So my name's Catherine and I run a governance office at the University of Leeds.
Right.
And one of my preoccupations when I look at applications, for sponsorship is around that patient autonomy. Are we being clear about what we're doing? The contractual side for me. I think there's an interesting thing that came out of their slides, which was around the data. So my memory is a significant number of participants weren't keen on the idea of their data being shared without consent. And I think that's a national context, because at the moment the general public in this country are concerned about people accessing their electronic data that feel it's good. And I think it's not about clinical research, I think it's a bigger thing. And I think that's one of the aspects of this that we have to keep sighted on, is that the red top newspapers in the UK can change public opinion very quickly if they start to have a headline that says thousands of patients have been part of studies and they never even knew anything was happening about it. So that public engagement thing, wider than just patients, I think is really important in how we discuss this, so that our general public community feel that they understand what's happening. Because that did not happen well. The story of health and social care data being used in the UK was not handled well, and the consequences of that will continue for quite some time.
Okay,
so I think that general public context is important.
Yeah, thanks for reminding. No.
Just a point about gatekeepers and community consent. I was part of the Ottawa group that looked at cluster randomization ethics, and there was a real sense, it was led by Charles Weyer and Monica Taliot, and there's a real sense from that process that the only justification for not getting consent from competent individuals or carers of proxies for vulnerable individuals is infeasibility. That community consent does not substitute for that at all, and that nevertheless there's an obligation to inform the community, but it should not be viewed as either binding or a replacement. In clusters, it's particularly important not to confuse gatekeepers with people who have ethical ability to give consent for patients they look after. A physician, for example, can't give consent for the patients whom he looks after, the cluster that he's responsible for, to be put into a trial. So actually it looks to me as if we've got a situation where individual autonomy ethics have again been settled as the basic comparator. And so I sense that there's a very wide resistance to consent, so to research without ethics at all, trials without consent. Even when the risk seems to be really low, autonomy has become, I think, very important.
It's really interesting.
Okay. So, listen, there's a lot of people who want to ask questions, but I'm really sorry. I'm going to just take two more here. One here, and then one from over there. And I'm really sorry. But on the cluster trials, I mean, the original work that was done by Sarah Edwards, and there's a very large HTA monograph which sets out all of these issues in very great detail. It is an ethical rather than a health researcher's document, but if you're interested in the ethics of cluster trials, Sarah Edwards' HTA monograph sets 15 years on now, and it's still, ethics don't change.
Joanna, that clinician at UCLH, just as a proper clinician, we make those decisions the whole time about which treatment are we going to give our patients. We don't ask for consent and all this. And I think that's the thing that patients need more education, as you're saying, is that we make these decisions the whole time on very poor evidence of which ones we're going to put them in, which order we're going to use the various drugs or surgical procedures. And we don't think about giving consent. And then suddenly we do research. And then there's masses of consent.
Yeah,
I think it's public awareness.
And there's actually, Neil Dickard did a qualitative study where he found that very thing, that patients wanted to be consented for everything and thought they would be. They thought that all their doctors' decisions were thoroughly evidence-based and thoroughly consented, and they were the patients were wrong about that. So yeah.
Claire, last question.
Yeah, just a small point about the number of Zealand trials that have occurred. So there are actually 2 reviews, one by Schellings, as you point out, but also one by Adamson. And I went through them all and compared them. And of course, actually what they've discovered was largely different.
Oh, really?
There's actually 110 trials that cite the Zealand design, either single or double, that have been reported in those 2 reviews up to 2005. So just to clarify.
So
that is still
a small number, but I just thought I'd clarify.
So,
just plug it for Zealand.
about 110 trials in 35 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Out of about $500 million. James, fantastic talk. Thanks very much indeed.